I actually wanted to talk about something different today, talk a little bit more about continuous deployment for data science, but then in the last couple months, there was a few minor little things happened in the news around AI and stuff, and I thought it would make sense to at least comment on that one. And I'm going to do this with a gigantic, bold disclaimer. I have no idea what's going to happen in the future. So these are very random thoughts, some of it inspired by conversations with colleagues, but maybe there's a bit or a piece in there that makes you think a little bit further as well. I think we are, for sure, in for a very interesting journey. I'm not quite sure where that's going to end. So first of all, AI and data science, ChatGPT, OpenAI, whatever you want to call those things. Everybody now, I hear that the madman in San Francisco just bought, 100,000 GPU cards and will now build his own AI as well. Everybody's trying to play in this game, but anyway, it does require, and that's one of the big points, lots of public data, right? That coming to data science, you think, okay, so if it requires lots of public data, and also I need to upload my data to kind of be fused with that public data so I get interesting insights, you wonder if that's really what you want to do, right? And there were already a couple of instances where people were releasing quite sensitive information by asking innocent questions with that sensitive information to public sources. So now read the fine print, right? The fine print says that every query that you enter will be analyzed, not will be, but can be analyzed by humans. So this will be spilled. Not only will it be looked at to analyze what's happening by other people, but it will also be used to retrain that AI system. So you may not really want to do that if it's reasonably sensitive, interesting data that you have inside your organization. The other big piece is, of course, what do you actually want to get from an AI when you feed in data? Right? You don't want to start a conversation with that data. You want to get insights into the data, right? So I tried that over the weekend. I was playing a little bit, and I was uploading the iris data first. And it said, oh, this is the well-known iris data, and it gave me a full analysis of the iris data. And I said, that's a bit fishy. So I renormalized the iris data, and I changed the labels. So I wouldn't even call it anonymization, but it wasn't quite as obviously the iris data anymore. And suddenly it was very confused. And it said, based on the information provided, it essentially gave me nothing. Just said, okay, there are apparently 5 columns in the data. So I asked, can you also build a decision tree? And then it ended up explaining to me what a decision tree is. And I said, yeah, great, but can you actually build it on the data I just shared? And then it started to speculate around the data and went off in a totally different direction, right? It started talking, if you can't read it down here, it said there's a car purchase column in the data. There's no car purchasing column in the data, right? So it was actually generalizing into something. What's a typical conversation around data? And a typical conversation around data seems to be ending there. To be fair, if you continue the conversation a little bit, I think it's wrong anyway to talk about a conversation. All you give it is you provide prompts and you get reactions. It's not really a conversation. But if you continue providing these prompts and you dive a little bit deeper, it very, very honestly says, I'm a language model. I can't really find patterns in data, right? But maybe there's something other out there that can do that. And I think that's a really interesting part. So if you now think about all of these people that are building programs, Python, for instance, by interacting with ChatGPT, they are building up on the same type of content, right? They're refining that type of content. But if I upload data, I'm not interested in ChatGPT, that AI, providing more data. I'm actually asking it to do something more with it, abstract from it, learn something interesting from it. So that's not the same as from some text, extrapolate more text. Then there's, of course, all of this topic about generalization, hallucination, what people call about it, which I find interesting, because fundamentally what it does, it learns from existing data points, right? And then it generalizes from that. But what does generalization really mean? It essentially says, find regularities, and then you have data points here, and then you find something in the middle that says, looks very similar, so I'm going to find something similar to that one. That's really what ultimately generalization is. If you try that with NIME, it was actually a really interesting conversation. That's not really a conversation, but anyway. And it gave us beautiful, if you read this text, it reads totally meaningful. It says, comes straight out of a manual. So if you want to do this, you should use the interactive authentication node instead of the Google authentication node, and then everything will be fine. Sounds cool, right? The only problem is we don't have that node, right? The interactive authentication node doesn't exist. So this could be, it is clearly a problem with the analytics platform. If you look at that one, you say, yeah, we should probably build that, and there's a ticket to build that. So we could do two things. We could prioritize the development of this node so it gets done quicker so that ChatGPT is right. Or we have to admit that we have a lot of nodes in NIME, but it's not from a generalization perspective. Every now and then there are unexpected gaps. And these unexpected gaps come from us having to prioritize work of other things, right? So generalization, the ability to have a model that generalizes well, assumes that the data that you see is reasonably well generalized so that you can actually fill in meaningful gaps. Reality doesn't always generalize well if you just look at the data, right? And one big problem of that we talk about in other aspects as well, this generalization problem also comes up when it's about discrimination, right? Because fundamentally what you're doing is you're learning from past data points. You learn something in a way you could argue that the poor interactive authentication node got discriminated, right? Because it was outlined here. Or some other node that is also doing authentication got discriminated because it was not mentioned, right? So a lot of discrimination isn't bad. Right? That's fundamentally what data mining always does. We're trying to segment, we're trying to group, we're trying to differentiate. We are trying to discriminate between different data points. Right? In many ways, that's not a discrimination that we consider bad because we're looking at temperature or some other totally fine attributes, but you don't really know when it is bad. And finding out from an AI response when its response is actually based on data where you would consider that as ethically a problem, then that's a lot harder to do. And then there's, of course, finally the sharing part. I think that was something I got out of a conversation with a colleague who said one of the problems that he foresees with that type of AI is people will become a lot more careful about publicly sharing interesting content, right? Because when I post blog posts, and they are reasonably interesting, not all of my blog posts are, but some I hope are, then I hope that I get a little bit of credit for that, right? When you build up a bit of personal reputations, yeah, the stuff that Michael writes, every now and then it's useful, lots of weird stuff, but sometimes useful stuff, right? AI tentatively doesn't give credit, right? So the question is, will people still share as openly as they were before? Because the chances of people actually, search engines right now point you to interesting content. AI summarizes interesting content or generalizes from interesting content, right? So I have a hunch, or that person is postulated, said, well, we're going to be back to more locked, more non-public content because people don't want that, right? Or there's at least you exclude that from training material for AI models. And then there was this bold statement that SEO is dead because search engine optimization, getting search engines to point to your page is going to change into something. Getting AI to summarize in such a way that people will go to your page to finally find the content. That's going to be really rough. So I think that's an interesting little side effect here as well. So some early thoughts from me on the AI for data science. I think it's likely very useful for educational purposes, right? How do I do that? With little caveats, right? It will point you every now and then to things that don't yet exist. For guidance, why don't you try this out next? Right now, I mean, NIME Analytics platform has this built-in recommendation engine, marketing likes to call it AI, which really only looks at pairs of nodes, right? And then says, okay, it's very likely that you want to use this node. We can do a lot more with AI models to kind of help people to say, hey, why didn't you look at this? Or try out this something else. I think it's going to be super useful in many disciplines, not just data science, to skip the boring 60% where you just say, okay, can you get me a workflow that joins 2 Excel files and an Oracle database and does this and provides a scatter plot? You have a workflow, you say, hey, it doesn't quite do what I'm interested in doing, but now I start from something instead of starting from scratch. It's not going to give you the fully developed solution. That's extremely unlikely. And the other piece is think pair programming. Why do you do pair programming? Because you have one of the 2 developers is always kind of looking over the shoulder of the other one and makes sure they catch stupid mistakes early. Having an AI where you essentially say, do you find something fishy here? And the AI just saying, this looks weird and this I've never seen before. Maybe it's right, but at least it kind of points you to the instances where you might want to double check what's going on. Likely less useful in my mind for novel insights into data. Because really finding something interesting, new in the data is very likely something that nobody has seen before in similar types of data. So it's not something that you can generalize from, because they are, by definition, very rare instances, very rare insights. For highly sparse information data, right, if at the end of the day, one of the big worries of all of these AI models that are summarizing is also that the minorities get drowned out, right? They're not part of the summarization, right? If company A has 10,000 more mentions and stuff in articles talking about it than company B, chances that AI summarizes and will also mention B are much, much smaller, right? And then to me, I don't think this idea of hypothesis generation, when I was still at the university, we had this one talk about sparking insights. Data science, ultimately, in many, many instances, is about triggering this "that's weird" effect, where you look at your data and say, that's weird, that can't be right. And then you dig a little bit deeper, and then you start realizing, ooh, that's a strange little interesting effect. That, of course, in 95% of those cases, you'll find out that, oh, somebody really screwed up, right? So it was an error in the data. But the remaining 5% triggers a new interesting discovery, a new type of hypothesis. So I think it's not going to be that great. So I was relatively, and then, of course, for the analysis, I mentioned that proprietary private data, competitively super interesting data, right? We have representatives of pharma companies here. I'm not quite sure they would upload all of their screening data to a public AI to get some interesting insights, right? That type of stuff you need to do in isolation, maybe with a local copy. There may be ways around that. But if I'm doing that with my private copy, nobody else is going to benefit from that either, so my AI doesn't keep learning on it. So it's going to be isolated little discoveries. So I was a little bit the illusionist, so I looked around. Maybe other people have a stronger opinion about that or a better one. Here's a beautiful quote that I came across where somebody said, in 3 to 8 years, we will have a machine with the general intelligence of an average human being. I thought, that's bold. And that's a quote from Marvin Minsky from 1970. That was the first AI wave. So maybe I'm too old, I have too many déjà vus, but I'm carefully optimistic, but I'm also skeptical. I don't think we'll be running into this human intelligence type of thing. I see us much more working with much smarter side applications that augment human intelligence, right? They will help us to do a lot of stuff, the mundane tasks, a lot easier, faster, and maybe even get a bit more inspiration what to try out. But the last step in finding new insights in data, making something useful out with your data, is still going to be the human. So that's a bit frustrating. So I figured let's ask one other question. Would you recommend 9? And that's when I said, this stuff does work. Man, this is, Ritu, did you see this? I mean, it's marketing, perfect. And then, of course, I clicked, let it revise a couple more times, and it went into completely weird directions. But anyway, cool stuff.